Mr. President, most popular dictionaries define an act of war as an act of aggression by a country against another with which it is nominally at peace. Let me repeat, an act of aggression by another country against another with which it is nominally at peace. On Friday, America's intelligence community issued a damning, detailed assessment concluding that Russian strongman President Vladimir Putin ordered an attack on our nation's electoral system to sow mistrust and favor one candidate over another. The evidence was sweeping, overwhelming, and troubling. The key findings, quoted directly from the public version of this report from the intelligence agencies, said as follows: Russian efforts to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election represent the most recent expression of Moscow's long-standing desire to undermine the U.S.-led liberal democratic order. But these activities demonstrated a significant escalation in directness, level of activity, scope of effort compared to previous operations. We assess Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential elections. Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, harm her electability and potential presidency. We further assess that Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump. We also assess Putin and the Russian government aspired to help President-elect Trump's election chances when possible by discrediting Secretary Clinton and publicly contrasting her unfavorability to him. They go on to talk about the types of influence that the Moscow inspired. Madam President, I'm not going to stand here and argue that if the Russian efforts had not taken place, there would have been a different outcome in the election. No one will ever know that. And when asked directly, the intelligence agencies, despite these strong statements, say there's no evidence of direct vote tampering or tampering with election equipment, thank goodness. That isn't the point here. The point is Vladimir Putin and the Russians did what they could to influence our election. Americans should stand up and listen, because what is at stake here is the sovereignty of our nation and the reliability and integrity of our election process. What the Russians did was truly staggering and momentous. A foreign adversary intentionally manipulating America's democracy and election. I don't know if it's an act of war by classic definition. It is an attack on our nation by any definition. It should not go unanswered. For those who've been following Vladimir Putin's bullying actions over the last several years, this is no surprise. Instead of building a modern global economy based on the great talents of the Russian people, he and his closest enablers have been creating false enemies in the West, sadly and dangerously creating a narrative that domestic Russian problems are really the result of NATO, the United States, and the West. He has tried to discredit the West and its democratic free market institution. He has used manufactured enemies of Russia to rally domestic support for his tactics and leadership. It is ultimately a tired narrative that, when combined with domestic political repression and manipulation, keeps Putin in power. Let's not be fooled into thinking his actions are merely annoying. The threats are real and dangerous, and they go directly not just at the United States, but many of our strongest allies. I have a list here, which I'm going to ask unanimous consent be printed in the record in detail.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. NBC News compiled a document of activity by Russia and Vladimir Putin. It starts in April of 2007 in Estonia, where the Russians were disabling their internet. June 2008 in Lithuania, where the Russians hackers were defacing government web pages. August 2008 in Georgia, where the Russian hackers shut down the country's internal communication system. January 2009, Kyrgyzstan, as part of an effort to persuade the president there to evict a U.S. military base, the Russian hackers shut down 2 of the country's 4 internet service providers. April of 2009 in Kazakhstan, after the Kazakh media published a statement by the country's president that criticized Russia, a Russian-attributed attack shut down the publication's website. August 2009, Georgia, similar activity. May 2014 in Ukraine. March 2014 in Ukraine. May 2015 in Germany. December 2015 in Ukraine. October 2015 in the Netherlands. January 2016 in Finland. December 2016 in Germany. And of course, there's also the Russian military seizure of sovereign territory in the nation of Georgia in 2008 and their invasion of Ukraine in 2014. In fact, Russian forces and their proxies still hold captured land in Georgia and Ukraine. And from that spot in Ukraine, separatists shot down a civilian airliner 2 years ago, murdering 283 innocent passengers, including 80 children. This is our adversary. This is the man who's trying to undermine the American electoral system. We cannot take it lightly. Madam President, 20 years ago when I was elected to the Senate, I was a member of the Government Affairs Committee, and the first hearing that we had was a lengthy investigative hearing. What was the basis of it? We had just concluded a presidential campaign, and allegations were made that the Chinese government 20 years ago was trying to insert itself into the presidential campaign in the United States, specifically in support of the Clinton-Gore ticket. Fred Thompson was the chairman of that committee. Pretty well-known man, since passed, but he was a pretty outstanding lawyer in addition to being a pretty famous actor. He was my chairman. We spent months in public hearings investigating whether the Chinese tried to insert themselves in any way, shape, or form in the election of Clinton-Gore. Well, they could find virtually no evidence other than a handful of Buddhist nuns writing checks to the campaign, which nobody ever really explained, but no evidence that the Chinese government was involved in this in any specific way. We spent months in open hearing on that theory and then published reports, conflicting reports on conclusions from that committee. We took it that seriously 20 years ago. What are we doing about this? Well, Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, said, we'll do the regular order. We'll let the committees, regular committees, go about their business and figure out what might have happened in the course of that. That's not good enough. Regular order may put this investigation in the Intelligence Committee. Do you know what that means? It means you're not going to see their hearing. You're not going to be able to see their witnesses and listen to their testimony. And much of the evidence that's going to be presented will never be shared with the public. I understand the need to protect classified material. We must do that. I insist on that. But at the same time, we need to answer some basic questions about what Russia tried to do in this last election. And to make it clear to them and to the world, the United States is not going to be a sucker. We're not going to allow anyone who can hack into our systems try to undermine the electoral system of the United States. We are proud Americans. We'll handle our own elections, thank you. Keep your hackers out of business in the United States. Now, recently we've had allegations, and I underline the word allegations, of other involvement of the Russians with the Trump campaign and the preparation of certain documents which have not been collaborated as of this date. They may lead to nothing, but they certainly deserve investigation so that we know what the facts may be. I asked Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama yesterday at the Senate Judiciary Committee, a man who's aspiring to be Donald Trump's Attorney General, if he would recuse himself from investigations into Russian connections with the Trump campaign. He had just said earlier he was going to recuse himself from investigations involving Hillary Clinton. Senator Sessions said, and I quote, "I would review it and try to do the right thing as to whether or not it should stay within the jurisdiction of the Attorney General or not." I would hope that Senator Sessions, if he in fact becomes the Attorney General, will have some second thoughts. It is far better to consider a special counsel in the Department of Justice in light of the political circumstances of these allegations. Secondly, we need to have a select committee, not the Intelligence Committee of either the House or the Senate, that will meet and consider this information and investigate it in a responsible way. In fact, I think it's of such gravity that we ought to consider a public-private commission, a commission of elected officials as well as private citizens whom we respect. I think of the names General Colin Powell, former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, as chairs or co-chairs of that effort, people of unquestionable integrity who will make the right findings for America and not for any political reason, as far as I'm concerned. Today, I asked Michael Mukasey, former Attorney General under President George W. Bush, whether the Attorney General has the authority to shut down an FBI investigation, and he answered very simply, yes. So we need more information. We need to make sure that this is taken seriously, that we address it in a serious manner, because it's a serious issue. But what in fact has been the response from the other side of the aisle, with a few notable exceptions? That party of Ronald Reagan, the 40th president, who really understood the old Soviet regime, has greeted this information with near silence. That's right, except for a few voices, my colleagues, Senators Graham and McCain in particular, near silence. How in the world did an attack ordered by a former Soviet KGB official on our nation become a partisan issue that is largely ignored by a majority of one of our nation's two great political parties? How did the Republican Party, which now controls both chambers of Congress, decide that repealing health care insurance for millions of America was the most urgent first priority to deal with amid the sweeping evidence of a Russian attack on our democracy? Ronald Reagan must be rolling in his grave. Does anyone remember his clarity standing up against attacks on the West and its allies when the Soviets shot down a civilian Korean airliner in 1983? This is what President Reagan said. And make no mistake about it, this attack was not just against ourselves or the Republic of Korea. This was the Soviet Union against the world and the moral precepts which guide human relations among people everywhere. It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations. Madam President, there was a time in this town when national security issues were truly bipartisan, when security meant patriotically putting aside partisan agendas. Can anyone here imagine for a second, just 1 second, the debate we should be having here now if the situation were reversed? The House alone spent millions of dollars on countless and ultimately fruitless investigations into the tragic events at Benghazi. Here we are with overwhelming evidence of an actual attack on our nation, and the majority party is largely silent. Incredible. It is quite simply an abdication of political responsibility not to address a verified national security threat to our nation. Madam President, with the release of Friday's report, I urge my colleagues to read both the public and classified reports. The classified version contains the same damning and sweeping conclusions I mentioned here today from the public document, but it goes into detail. As such, I urge this body to come up with an appropriate response to this attack. I've joined in bipartisan Russian sanctions legislation with Senators Cardin, McCain, Menendez, Graham, Shaheen, Rubio, Klobuchar, Sass, and Portman. We urge that we quickly advance, as an urgent priority, Russian sanctions to make it clear what they've done is reprehensible, unacceptable, and won't be tolerated. This Congress can also do what many tried to do in the past and failed, and it's certainly timely, and that is pass meaningful cybersecurity legislation. We have to maintain our strong NATO alliance, stand firm against Russian meddling or attacks, tell our friends in the Baltics, and Poland in particular, that we stand by their side and nothing has changed, that our friends in Ukraine can trust that we'll be with them as they establish a democratic sovereignty. We must work with the new administration to fully accept and counter this Russian threat. We must work to undermine any such future attacks at home and against our allies. And we should get to the bottom of the extremely troubling allegations that have been made recently. Yes, Ultimately, we must work with Russia where those efforts serve our global interest. And I think there will be some common areas, but we must not do so from a position of weakness. We will never be taken seriously by Putin or our adversaries otherwise.